Minister Barbara Creecy joins us now for that conversation. And Minister, good evening. I've got to thank you for your time. Let me start with a basic question. I doubt, and you can tell me more, I doubt we're still at a stage where there's even a debate about us living with the real, daily consequences and impact of climate change. A few years ago, we used to say climate change will. I believe we are now at a point where we are saying climate change is doing X, Y, and Z in terms of its impact on us in South Africa.
Good evening, Thulasizwe, and greetings to all your viewers at home. And yes, indeed, I think that the debate about whether or not we are living through climate change is closed. All of us in our daily lives are experiencing. We've seen the floods, we've seen drought, wildfires, and of course, those of us who are on the wrong side of 50 also know that in our own lifetimes we have seen the weather warming, winters are not as harsh as they used to be, and of course, we have lived through the terrible devastation of the floods in KwaZulu-Natal. And as you say, women and girls bear the brunt of climate change because of their particular role in the family structure, but also because in our country, almost 3 million women are involved in informal agricultural production and many more informal agricultural production. And of course, agricultural production is one of the sectors of the economy, together with tourism and the biodiversity economy that is extremely hard hit by extreme weather events.
So let's talk a bit more about those extreme weather events. And we've seen, as you say, the floods, the felt fires, but also the droughts in various regions of our country. One region after another, and even now we're dealing with a few of those. When those events, those adverse weather events occur, if we park for a moment the impact on women as producers of food that you just spoken to, what is the impact of the adverse weather events in terms of disruption of livelihoods and displacement of people, and what does that translate to in terms of women's vulnerability within this particular context in South Africa, where women already face, those vulnerabilities in any case?
Well, immediately after the floods in KZN, I visited a community where more than 450 shacks had been swept away. And it was a very sad visit, but it was also a very interesting visit, because while 450 shacks had been swept away, there was only one death in that community. And the women of that community had organized. They worked in a partnership with the city of eThekwini and also the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And they had learned about climate change. They had learned about what could happen with an extreme storm event, and they had used that knowledge to save their own lives, the lives of their children, and broader lives within the community. So I think that, of course, they were very traumatized by the event. They spoke to me a lot about the fear that their children had of going back to that settlement. They were at that stage living in a refuge in a community hall. They spoke about the impact it had had on their children and the fear that their children had of future flooding events. And these women were now having to go to work. They were having to send their children to school, and they were having to look after the family in a community hall. So while they had a certain degree of resilience, they were nevertheless the ones that even in the face of the disaster were carrying the burden of the family.
In a moment, Minister, we will talk about what do we do then, having diagnosed these vulnerabilities that are exacerbated by climate change on women. But before we do that, there's a unique one that I picked up on a report by the World Food Programme discussing the exact same topic and talking about something that I never really thought about in terms of the gender roles in a patriarchal society like ours that are, sort of assigned in a way to women in our society, especially in rural areas. It says here, droughts and desertification can mean that women and girls must travel further each day searching for water and firewood, increasing their workload and exposing them to risks of violence. You don't instantly think about these, created gender roles and link them to climate change and impacts such as what the WFP is describing here.
Yes, indeed. I think that because in many areas of our country, women are still fetching water from rivers, women and young girls, because in many areas of our country, women and young girls are still walking long distances to fetch firewood for cooking and for heating. Obviously, as climate change impacts ever more severely on communities, they are going to have to go further in their search for water. I mean, we know at the moment in the whole area surrounding Gqeberha that the communities there are very close to day zero. So you would find a situation where even women who are living in an urban setting who would normally be getting water from the tap are going to have to go to water tankers. They're going to have to send their children to fetch water from water tankers. And as we know, our country is not a safe country, and it's not a safe place for women and girls. And of course, this does expose young women and girls to a range of dangers if they are having to go far away to forest areas and into communities to fetch water where they don't know people.
So lastly then, Minister, how do we deal with this situation? I believe that we've moved from when issues of responding to climate change were international relations issues, when we were still talking about, the various conferences, climate conferences, and building up to the Paris Climate Agreement. We're now talking about what do we do locally. How do we center women in our response and what we do around issues of climate change?
Well, there are three current areas that I would want to refer to. The first is the adaptation strategies that we are working on together with all provincial governments and municipalities. And obviously, what we understand is that climate change affects different municipalities and different regions of our country differently. So we need tailor-made strategies for different areas that will improve the resilience of communities, and in particular, because of the role that women play in those communities, help women to be more resilient in order to adapt. So, for example, if it's an agricultural community, issues of securing water sources, securing water storage facilities would be important. The second area I want to talk about is what we call the just transition. Because what we understand is that in addition to adapting to climate change, we also have to do our bit to reduce greenhouse gases. And we know that in Mpumalanga, for example, that is the coal belt of our country. And over the next 30 years, we have a target to reach net zero emissions. And this means that we will gradually exit from coal, both as a fuel source and as an export commodity. And that means that we have to work with communities to ensure that there are alternative forms of livelihoods, and livelihoods for those who would be most vulnerable and least skilled. And the Climate Commission has just completed the Just Transition Framework, which we will be shortly taking through the Cabinet process.
All right, Minister, let me get into real trouble now because I'm completely out of time and my producers are telling me I'm completely out of time. I can take that trouble. I think I would get into even more trouble if I failed to ask you about the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's speech today, which was really about making this big pronouncement around U.S. Policy and strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa. And it links to the issues that you and I are discussing this evening, in that one of the 4 pillars that he highlighted has to do with resilience building and responses to climate change. Is the United States right in putting that issue at the heart of its strategy and relationship with Africa, with South Africa?
Well, unfortunately, I've been in another meeting all day, so I didn't hear his speech, but let me say this. The Paris Agreement requires that developed countries do need to be supporting the transition of developing countries such as ours. What we want to know is that the United States, as they make policy pronouncements, are also putting their money where the pronouncements are, and that there will be more and more money made available for developing countries, not just South Africa, but in the whole of Africa, who are highly vulnerable to climate change, but who had very little to do with creating it in the first place.
All right, I've got to thank you for your time and your insights this evening. That's Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and Environmental Affairs, Barbara Creecy.